Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, truck filmmaker. Oh, look at that truck. Comedian. Wow, that's another truck. And what are we trucks?
You make it sound like it's like the dog from Up or something, distracted by squirrels. But
was that quite. Doug? Was that Doug's name?
Yeah,
Doug?
Doug. Mm-hmm. Doug was always saying squirrel. Not quite like that. But Jason is alluding to the charming distractions of the filmmaker Agnes Varda in this movie that we're about to talk about. We are looking at the films of the year 2000 and here at our documentary episode to talk about Agnes Varda's The Gleaners and I, which is considered by some one of the best documentaries of all time on the Sight and Sound list that Jason both hates and is a slave to. So,
yeah, I do. I have the long-term project to watch every movie on there, and Varda had 3, so I watched all 3 of them this week. So, the list is garbage. Not garbage. It's just ridiculous. So.
But Jason's watching every movie.
Well, I mean, the movies are really good. I just don't. It's like a good list of like, hey, do you want to get a good view of world cinema, like great movies from around the world, but also like to say like, what is this, the 67th best movie ever made? Like, come on.
All right. Jason thinks maybe they should just have renamed it, Hey, do you want to see some good movies?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd watch that. Hey, you looking for something to watch this weekend?
Yeah, maybe it wouldn't have gotten as much attention, but this is, regardless of your assessment, certainly considered one of the greatest documentaries of all time, and probably the most famous documentary film that Agnes Varda made. She's one of these rare filmmakers who I think is equally known for working in narrative film and documentary. And we talked about Werner Herzog, for example, who's I think maybe the most notable example of that, but it's not a common thing. And in terms of documentary, I think this is her most famous movie.
Oh, so there's actually a sequel to this, The Gleaners and I, 2 years later, which I watched as well. And she says in that no movie she's ever made has gotten the reception and the feedback and the love that this one has got.
Yeah, and I think that was partially maybe because at the time that this was released, it got all that attention. And maybe her earlier films, it took a little longer for her to build up the reputation that she got as part of the French New Wave.
Well, I think it's more than that, because you had mentioned that she kind of is, besides the documentarian, she makes herself a subject in it. I know I thought of kind of like our Michael Moore episodes, and I know how much you dislike Michael Moore and everything, but
I'm back and forth on Michael Moore. I wouldn't say that I dislike him inherently.
All right. Well, her style of inserting herself is, as you said, charming. Like, she's part of the stuff she does about herself is some of the best stuff in this film, right? So I think part of the adoration is that people love to love her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. And I didn't think of Michael Moore when I was watching this movie. I thought more of Ross McElwee, who we discussed a couple seasons ago.
I also thought of him as well.
Yeah, because I think the thing about Michael Moore when he inserts himself is he's sort of the antagonist to the people that he's making a film about, because he has a very specific political viewpoint. And that's the opposite of what she's doing. She's befriending all these people.
Right. But Michael Moore maybe becomes the main subject of his films. Ross McElwee becomes the main subject of his films. Agnes Varda is kind of like a side character in the film.
Right. I mean, and I think part of the criticism of Michael Moore would be that he shouldn't be the main subject of his films because of what his films are about, versus Varda or McElwee, where you want the movie to be about them because they're charming, as we said, or fascinating. But either way, yes, this was certainly a highly acclaimed film. It was successful. I didn't get any box office figures. Something like this, I'm sure, had a very limited release in the US. Allegedly played for over 8 months at some theaters in Paris, in France, where Agnes Varda is from, and received many, many awards for Best Documentary from critics groups, including the New York Film Critics Circle, the Boston Society of Film Critics, Los Angeles Film Critics Association, as well as French film critic groups. And critics overall very positive about this. It got 2 thumbs up from Ebert and Roper. And in his review, Roger Ebert said, Agnes Varda, of course, is a gleaner herself. She is gleaning the gleaners. And in what appears to be a documentary, she conceals a tender meditation about her own life and life itself. In The Gleaners and I, she has a new tool, a modern digital camera. We sense her delight. She can hold it in her hand and take it anywhere. She is liberated from cumbersome equipment. She shows how the new cameras make a personal essay possible for a filmmaker, how she can walk out into the world and without the risk of a huge budget, simply start picking up images as a gleaner finds apples and potatoes.
2 things about that. So first, the part of her gleaning the gleaner, she does talk a lot about how she in her art is gleaning, and the title in French is The Gleaners and the Female Gleaner, as opposed to The Gleaners and I. I think, Josh, that I, upon first watching it, did not give it enough credit in regards to the digital camera aspect of it, because we're so used to it now, right? And the more I researched Varda, she was saying like it brought her back to the days of the 50s where she was making short films and she could just do anything. And we talked about this with, McElwee as well, where he kind of designed equipment that he could use on the run and everything. This is a different version of that, but I think maybe it would have had a different impact on us, like had we seen this when it came out, but we're so used to this now that it's tough to properly place in that regard.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting what Ebert points out here, the idea that, with the digital camera, it makes it possible to make a movie that's a personal essay. And of course, Ross McElwee was making those movies before digital cameras. But as we talked about when we talked about Sherman's March, he had to really put in a lot of effort in order to make that kind of film and, kind of devise his own methods. Whereas Varda is able to just buy a camera, pick it up and go. And yeah, I agree with you. I think this is this is more revolutionary than we might realize watching it now, because this is such a familiar mode of filmmaking, and virtually every movie is made with a digital camera now. But I also thought of Dancer in the Dark that we just talked about, which is a narrative film made with digital cameras. And one of my big impressions from Dancer in the Dark was that it looked like garbage. And this movie is made with a similar camera. It wouldn't surprise me if this movie is made with a cheaper camera, even than what Von Trier was able to get for Robbie Mueller to use on Dancer in the Dark. But it looks much better. The cinematography is much prettier in this film, I think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not the lighting per se, because it's so naturalistic, but I know you love Cleo from 5 to 7. I watched that. I watched Vagabond. Dude, Agnes Varda can move a camera. She is really, really, really good with her shot setups and the way she's able to fill a frame and kind of create a pace in her films. So this I could see as this wonderful toy for her.
Right. I mean, and she even almost emphasizes it as if it's a toy. There's that one scene where she says, I forgot to turn off the camera and the lens cap was dangling. And she uses that footage and sets it to some jaunty music and is like, hey, look, I'm just having fun with this new thing that I got.
But I think that's important, because if in lesser hands, it comes off as amateurish, right?
Right.
But in the hands of a master like Varda, it not only comes off as adding to it, but also adding to the overall feel of how we feel about her.
Yeah, I think so. And I think something like that kind of footage, which was accidentally captured, is perfectly in line with the idea of gleaning, that it's something that would be discarded probably by other filmmakers, but she picks it up and incorporates it.
Right. So I looked up gleaning, which comes from all the way back in the biblical times, Josh. And there's a difference between gleaning and picking. Do you know what it is?
Right. Well, gleaning is the idea that you gather what's left over after presumably it's been picked, and it's picking it up off the ground.
Right. So yeah, I think in a way you're right. Gleaning, you pick up, picking, you pick down, right? So if you're picking something off a tree, maybe, is that right? Does that sound right? Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea here is that because the harvest has already occurred, everything has come off the trees or wherever it is and is now fallen on the ground, and then you can pick up what's left. Although there is some gleaning in this movie. There's the one scene where the group of people find the vineyard that for some reason was not harvested at all, and it's past the date of harvest, and so they can go in and harvest the whole vineyard themselves. And they're picking obviously in that sense rather than picking up off the ground. So it's kind of muddied, but I think you're right about the technical definition.
It's an interesting subject matter, and the entire historical aspect and also the cultural aspect of a lot of these. We think about where we're at in society and how selfish a lot of people are, a lot of institutions are, and then you get to like a lot of these vineyards, and they're like, yeah, this is just not only commonplace, but it's also the law. After we're done, they get to come in and they get to pick stuff up, and it helps feed people, and it helps get rid of food waste. So what's the downside of that?
Right. It's great. And I think that part of that comes from like French culture and common law culture, where in France, some law from the 1500s or whatever that's still on the books that was designed to help peasants is still enforceable or whatever. And that's an amount of history that like we don't have here in the US.
I mean, at the same time, at the time of this recording, Arizona just, passed an abortion ban, relying on a law from 1864 when they weren't even a state yet. So
it's not always good. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is that idea of this long cultural history and traditions. Yeah, exactly. So critic-wise, Kevin Thomas in the Los Angeles Times said, Agnes Varda would probably agree with Jean Renoir's remark that in making a film, he discovered its meaning as he went along. For more than anything else, her captivating new documentary, The Gleaners and I, is charged with the pleasure of discovery the world around her from a fresh perspective, and of rediscovering herself after devoting most of the past decades celebrating, restoring, preserving, and reviving the legacy of her late husband, director Jacques Demy, who died of leukemia in 1990. Varda and her films have always been at once earthy and intellectual, and her love and respect for nature and her inquiring mind are in full evidence in this marvelous film.
Right. So in the sequel, she talks a lot about how, the love and adoration she got from this film. And she's like, but it's not about me. It's about all these gleaners and all these subjects. They're so wonderful. And they are. There's a lot of wonderful, interesting people in here, but she's one of them.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think this was, as we said, this was sort of the start, not that she hadn't made documentaries or documentaries that she participated in before, but this was the start of, I think, this period where she was like the world cinema's grandma or whatever, you know, and was this sort of beloved figure, like Werner Herzog in a way, who was her own sort of her persona that people gravitated towards.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do want to catch up on that point where about finding the meaning as it's being made. Like that to me is one of the most exciting elements of this film, where she's like, yeah, so this led me to that, right? And I thought while I was watching that, like, man, that would be a really fun project to tackle as a documentary, where maybe you don't even know what the documentary is, but you start with like an interview or a subject, and whatever that kind of riff leads you to next, like almost jazz or whatever, improv, whatever. And you can just put together a full story based on that. I think like Varda would have been perfect for that. McElwee would be perfect for that. It would be a fun project for, let's us three make that documentary.
So you're saying like a different filmmaker would pick up the next segment?
No, I'm saying like, hey, I'm going to go interview X person, or whatever X person talks about, whatever that subject is, that subject leads you to the next interview or interstitial or segment of watching people doing that. And you just kind of, freestyle. It's like freestyling a documentary, I would
That's
say.
Exactly how To a John Wilson works. Is the exact thing.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't seen that show either, but I feel like that's the kind of thing that the people you just mentioned there, like Ross McElwee and Agnes Varda, can do because they're so talented and because they have that experience and they have that ability, that you really need to have a level of filmmaking skill for that not to just seem like a random collection of nothing.
I think that goes back to what we're saying about when, she's showing the Lemscap footage, like in lesser hands, it's like, why are you doing this? But with her, it all makes sense.
Right. Absolutely.
So you guys in? You guys want to make this documentary?
I don't know if we're at the skill level of those people we just mentioned. So that's probably not something
Josh,
we should attempt.
Might I remind you of our multi-award wins in the 48-hour film festival?
Yeah, it was like 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, we've been building. We've been building towards this. So.
Sure we have. So review-wise, finally, Stephanie Zacharek in Salon said, Agnes Varda's The Gleaners and I is something of an odd bird, a cross between a documentary, an art film, and a personal reflection on aging. But just in case any of those things, let alone a combination of the three, is enough to make you head for the hills, it's important to stress the solid workaday qualities that keep The Gleaners and I from floating off into the ether. To the extent that it qualifies as an art film, it's one that's also urgent, graceful, accessible, and at times openly cheerful. It takes a big bite out of life.
Yeah, I agree, Josh. I'm good with that.
You like taking bites out of life?
I like taking bites out of heart-shaped potatoes.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is one of the things, though, is that, she, as much as she's talking about how she's getting older and she's filming her hands and the way they look now, and she's looking at her gray hair and whatever, she still has this sense. This is something that like Richard Roper said in the Ebert and Roper segment, she has this sense of childlike wonder about everything. She's so excited to meet all these people and learn about what they're doing and find new people who are doing cool stuff. And that's really infectious.
That is. It's like she's a woman you want to hug and spend time with.
Right. And I think that's sort of the reputation that she got after making this film. So Jason, you did a big crash course in Agnes Varda here, but you had not seen her films before?
No, I mean, obviously I was aware of her, especially with Faces Places, which came out a couple years back. But yeah, she was one of these filmmakers that I hadn't been able to check off of anything. But I got a good run on it this week. Vagabond, like I told you guys, is a really good companion piece to this. And also, this is her documentary in the year 2000, but she plays with this subject matter in Vagabond and other movies that she was making in the 80s. So it's interesting to see the lead up to this.
Yeah, I wish I'd had more time this week to watch some other films. Prior to this, I had seen Faces Places, which, as you said, was a big kind of resurgence. It was one of her later films. She died in 2019, and that was just a few years before that. And I was a bit disappointed in Faces Places, which is a similar kind of thing where she kind of travels around and visits different people. But it's co-directed with this guy, JR, who is a much younger photographer who does these huge scale photo projects. And I think maybe I found him a little, I mean, as we're saying, you have to be the right kind of filmmaker and the right kind of person for this to work. And I found him a little smug and annoying maybe. And so that collaboration I didn't love, but I had seen Cleo from 5 to 7, which is her most famous film from the French New Wave era, a number of years ago, and really, really liked that. So I'd love to go back and see some of those older films.
Cleo from 5 to 7 is interesting because it's 62, right? So you're really kind of, I don't want to say proto-French New Wave, but you're right at the beginning of it. So a lot of these things that she's doing, a lot of these kind of techniques that she's using are really interesting to put in the context of that space. And then also when, if you really deep dive the French New Wave, there's the separation between the left bank French New Wave and, of course, the Cahiers du Cinema French New Wave, which I'm a part of. And she's more of that left bank French New Wave. So it's just, it's film nerd stuff right here, right? We're all a bunch of film nerds. So we have a film podcast because we're nerds.
I mean, I don't think you need to backpedal from being excited about the French New Wave.
I'm happy to be a film nerd, Josh. Yeah. I wear it with pride.
We don't need disclaimers about our enthusiasm for film.
Josh, you mentioned the awards that this thing was, it won a lot of awards, but one I found interesting was the French Union of Film Critics named it the best French film of 2000. And usually they would always choose a dramatic film. So I thought that was cool that they chose this documentary.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing is Agnes Varda especially is this sort of French national treasure in a way. And even by 2000, I think a lot of those new wave filmmakers were either like Jean-Luc Godard, as we talked about, who kind of went off into his own weird world, or maybe weren't working as much anymore. And she remained really at the forefront of French filmmaking all the way until her death.
You made a good point earlier about like her, kind of stature in both the doc world and in the narrative world, because in those narratives, she's using some of these techniques, especially in Vagabond, where it's like people looking at the camera and telling the story. Cleo does it too in some ways. So she's always kind of mixing the form, and that's one of the things that makes her so interesting.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, Dave, had you seen any Agnes Varda films before this?
No, I just knew of her name as, this celebrated name in documentaries, but had never seen this or any of her work.
And you just watched this one?
Just this one. Yeah, I'd love to watch more, but I really loved this one. So
yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah. I mean, I really do. I was hoping to watch a few more because I especially, again, had loved Cleo from 5 to 7. And hopefully I'll get back to, there's a ton of Agnes Varda films on the Criterion channel. So I'd love to watch more of those.
Yeah, as I said, I recommend Vagabond. But Dave, if you love this movie, you should watch the sequel, which is as fun.
Right on.
So anything else you want to mention about the background of this film, Jason?
Varda said, "I'm not poor. I have enough to eat, but I use another type of gleaning, which is an artistic gleaning. You pick ideas, you pick images, you pick emotions from other people, and then you make it into a film."
Yeah, and I think that's sort of her central thesis here, and that we can really understand from watching it. So we'll get into more of that and our general thoughts on the Gleaners and I when we come
I'm
back.
going to glean your thoughts in this next segment.
You sure are. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this season on the films of the year 2000, we are talking about our documentary pick, which is The Gleaners and I from Agnes Varda. And as we've said, I think, the overwhelming sense that you get from this movie is how fun it would probably be to hang out with Agnes Varda, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to hug her, like I said, and just hang out and hear stories of, her younger days and all the interesting things she did. That was always one of my favorite things. My grandfather was a comedian for over 60 years, and just hearing him and my grandma talk about all the things that they did was like, it was always just like a treat. And that's what I felt like it would be like to sit with Agnes Varda.
Right. And her later documentaries, I haven't seen The Beaches of Agnes or her final film, Varda by Agnes, or I think that's what it's called. But those were both like reflections on her career where I think she does exactly what you say. And she kind of talks about, reminisces, talks about things that she's done and looks back at her previous films and what they mean to her now and things like that. So I'm sure that's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I mean, you used the word reflexive, which is a reflexive first person. Those are words that always come up with her in her filmmaking style, but she called it a ciné-écriture, cinema writing, Josh.
Yes. And I think that, the idea of it being a personal essay, as one of those reviews mentions, again, going back to Ross McElwee or, a lot of other filmmakers, I think were probably inspired by this and her later films to go on and make their own personal films.
We touched on this, but I don't know if we've made it noted how difficult it is to pull off what McElwee did with Sherman's March, or what she does here, right? Like, I think I told you a while ago, I watched this documentary about like, what was that? It wasn't Area 51, but it was another one of these bases in Nevada and everything. And I was like, oh, cool, this is an interesting subject. I, want to find out about UFOs and alien technology and this and that. And the filmmaker, obviously, instead of doing that, just made it about himself and his journey to find it. And it was like, this is terrible. Like, it's just a really bad angle to take. And it's not well done. It's clunky. It's annoying. You're not giving me the information. So to pull this off is not easy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we were saying before, is that the idea that it seems easy, right? Oh, I'm just going to kind of wander around and, offer up my musings about my life and fill my lens cap. And how hard could it be? But it's in a way harder than making a straightforward documentary about a particular subject, because you have to get that balance perfectly right. You have to know what to include and what not to include. You have to have insights that are really like captivating to your audience, and Varda does, and McElwee does, and other filmmakers like this do as well. But I think you're right, Jason. There are plenty of filmmakers who take the wrong lesson and decide, oh, I'm making a documentary about subject X, and I have to include my journey toward learning about that subject as part of the documentary.
And that is a tried and true technique. And like you had mentioned, Michael Moore, who I like, but I get that you find him up and down with that style because it's so much about him. But I do think like it is, like you're saying, a fine line to walk.
Right. I mean, and with Michael Moore, it's interesting because he's essentially a celebrity now and people want to see him. You go see a Michael Moore movie, you're just as interested in seeing Michael Moore talk about what he thinks about something as you are in the people that he's going to document. And that's annoying for one particular reason. But like the thing you're describing with that Alien movie is annoying for a different reason, where it's like, who the hell is this guy? And why do I care about his personal journey? Right.
Right. At least Michael Moore is still giving you information and insight into something, whether you like the way he's doing it or not.
Right. Right. So let's talk about this film, though. Did you have a favorite Gleaner?
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. I think a lot of people really like that guy at the end, Alain, who is when he's not gleaning, he sells newspapers outside of a building. And even though he has very little money, he still volunteers and teaches immigrants how to speak French. And I think a lot of people really liked him in the film.
Yeah, I think he seems really selfless, which is obviously endearing, that he's doing all the things that he does for the right reasons. Not that anyone, I think, here is doing things for the wrong reasons. I mean, the closest I think she gets to that is those young people who just like went to the supermarket and knocked over dumpsters because they thought it would be fun. And they maybe seem kind of like dicks or whatever. But otherwise, all of these people are gleaning for noble purposes, whether it's that guy, Alain, who's kind of trying to give back, or other people we see, poor people who live in this sort of like, I don't know if you would call them homeless exactly, because they live in these trailers, but they're maybe kind of squatting on land where they have the trailers, and they have nothing, and so the gleaning for them is a way to actually like live. But either way, these people are doing what they're doing for the right purpose. But I think with Alain, you also have him kind of giving outward.
That whole idea is so interesting that it's culturally inherent, right? Like these guys just didn't pick up and do this. This has been something that's part of, as you said, French culture for hundreds of years. So that historical aspect of it is interesting to think that people know, like, hey, there is something in place for us, even though we are struggling in so many other ways.
Right. And something where there's probably a culture there, at least at that time, and hopefully still now, I think, even with more conservative governments that rise in these countries, that there is a greater culture in some of these European countries of helping people like that, or the government accommodating ways to help them, something like this, where they're not directly being given anything, but they have the right to come in and collect things that are left over. Whereas in some countries, we try to criminalize any kind of activity like that.
What countries would do that?
Lilliput, maybe. That's probably.
It's just so, why waste the food anyway, right? That's what a lot of these gleaners say, like, hey, I understand that, they have to throw the food out because of the tight restrictions, via the health boards, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. So if we can get it, we can still make good meals out of it. And I'm all for that. I couldn't do it because I'm OCD. So I couldn't glean, Josh. I couldn't go through the garbage and, salvage, but that's more of a commentary on me.
Right. Well, yeah, I think I would feel the same way. I mean, there's one scene where I forget the guy's name, but the guy who lives in the trailer and doesn't, he doesn't have a job, and he doesn't really I think he gets some sort of welfare, but it runs out, and he talks about getting his food from the trash, and he picks up some package of cheese, and he's like, oh, this just expired 2 days ago. It's totally fine. And I'm sure he's right. But yeah, I'm with you in that I might be like, I don't know. But obviously we're comfortable. We're not in the situation that he's in. And it's easy for us to say, well, we probably couldn't do that. But if you're where he is and you do it out of necessity, then maybe you could.
Right. I also thought it was interesting because you're mentioning that guy, the trailer, but then they showed those other gentlemen who were like living in, I don't even know what you would call it. It was like kind of like a cave that they built out of modern interior city materials. What would you call that, Josh?
Yeah, I don't
even
know. It almost looked like those guys lived in a junkyard. You're talking about the guys who would salvage like
Yeah,
refrigerators and appliances and fix them up and sell
yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was where they lived or where it was just like a sort of area where they kept all their stuff and fixed it up. Because those guys were not homeless, right? Those guys had a place to live and they were doing this as sort of a way to make a living, right? They salvage these things, they fix them up, then they are able to make money by selling them to people.
I think they did live there though.
Okay.
Like the older Asian man who was
Right.
like, yeah, Solomon comes and goes whenever he wants, right? So it's like, if that's what he's doing, that's a place for him to kind of stop over, I guess.
Right. Yeah, maybe so. I mean, a lot of it is just sort of, she gives you little snippets and you don't have necessarily the entire full context. But I like that there's a range that there's people like that and like the guys who are living in the trailers who are clearly doing this because this is the way that they live. And then there are people like Alan at the end, and there's the other guy who talks about like, yeah, I have an apartment and I pay my rent and I have a job, but I still salvage everything because it's sort of my viewpoint on the world that like we're wasting all this stuff and we shouldn't
Right.
be.
That's the guy who wore the galoshes, right? And
Yes.
said he was like the lord of the town and everything.
I like
right?
that guy.
Yeah.
So in the sequel, that guy, he has been committed to a psych ward
Oh,
and he's out, but he doesn't have the boots anymore. And he says, I'm no longer the lord of the town. I'm a prisoner of the town. Like
Oh.
he can't leave the town. But he's also going on like TV and talking about why he gleans and everything. And he seems like it seems like people really like him. So it's a strange juxtaposition.
yeah, that is, I mean, that sounds sad, but maybe it worked out okay for him. But again, I think it's interesting that she looks at all that different type. I mean, she shows a couple different people who are artists who, again, presumably have comfortable places to live. They don't need to glean for subsistence purposes, but they do that in order to create their art. And I thought those guys were pretty interesting. And I did think there was an amusing scene with one of those guys who's going around all the time and picking up all this trash essentially to use for his art. And he tells her something like, oh, I'm trying to really like pare down and minimalize. And she's like, really? Is that what this looks like? And I
Felt
did
like that was
appreciate-
me.
yeah. I mean, I appreciated that was because again, she's not an antagonist to any of these people, but that was one moment where she pushed back a little and was like, are you sure about that? And I was amused by it.
My favorite incident like that was when she was talking to the one gleaner, and he's like, yeah, the government's really helpful. They put out a map of when we can glean, like days and where things are going to be dropped off. And she's like, well, I don't really think that's a map for gleaning. That's just a map to let people know when they can throw out certain trash items. But he took it in a very different way.
And that's that same guy. So yeah, that's definitely amusing. And she has those moments of humor and, juxtapositions. She gets the guy who's in like a judicial robe reading those ancient laws, like standing in a field of cauliflower.
Yeah, that was fun. He's a judge, yeah.
Right.
So, or a lawyer. But what did you think of, we've kind of talked about one of the high points being her insertion of herself. And, I referenced the trucks, these like little interludes where she's driving and she's like, after that, we went to the island filled with oysters, right? And it's like, but they're always driving. And she's like, what is in that truck? Here's another truck. Like she has a very interesting obsession with the trucks.
Right. I mean, I think thematically it probably ties in because those trucks are probably transporting things like vegetables and potatoes and whatever that have been harvested. But actually, the thing I thought of during those sequences, because she puts her hand kind of in front of the lens and squeezes like she's squeezing the trucks. And I kept thinking of the kids in the hall.
Yeah,
the guy,
crush your head.
Right. Exactly. That guy, which presumably was not a reference point for her, but maybe it could have been.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Could have been. So, Josh, I got to say one thing, having watched 4 of her movies this week, I feel like they all come out with like a super amount of momentum and it's tough to sustain it. I think in all of her movies, I've liked the first 2/3 or 3/4. And then by the time it ends, I'm like, cool, I was ready for it to end.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, this is a very short movie. It's like 80 minutes long. So I don't think it overstays its welcome, but it is episodic. It's really, like you said, it's a lot of those sequences of, oh, and now we drove to this place and we talked to these people. And then we drove to this place and we talked to these people. And there's less of an overarching structure. It doesn't build to a climax or anything like that. Unlike some of these personal documentaries, it doesn't give you some big revelation about her. She's not finding a long lost relative or something like that. So I think that's fair. But at the same time, it was so short that I was pretty invested in it all the way to the end. In fact, to the point where at the very end, I was like surprised that it had ended, because it didn't build to something. It was just, she gets this famous painting. She convinces this museum to get a painting of Gleaners out of storage, and they bring it out, and she says something like, "Oh, it was lovely to see it," and then the movie ends.
Well, there's a little more to it, and she goes into it in the sequel. Like they put the painting out in the sun in the day, and then the wind picks up, so it kind of lifts the painting, and she feels like there's something symbolic about that. Like she's trying to see what the inspiration was, but it's still nature or God or whatever taking over and letting her utilize whatever film magic there is.
Yeah, I mean, it is this sort of whimsical thought, and I guess maybe I was just a little caught off guard, like, oh, it's ending now.
Yeah. I think what we've kind of highlighted a bunch of the Gleaners. I think, the quote unquote fat in there is there are some other Gleaners that just aren't as interesting.
Yeah, I guess, but I feel like almost all of them. I mean, there's the guy who is like owns a vineyard and is also a psychoanalyst, and
a very famous psychoanalyst.
Yeah, I guess so. I didn't realize that until he talks about, she asks his wife, like, is it weird that he's both a winemaker and a psychoanalyst? And she's like, oh, no, I've gotten used to it. Like, I was in psychoanalysis, too, with Lacan. And I was like, oh, shit, Lacan. Like, he's like one of the most famous, writers on that subject of all time. So I guess this guy is a big deal.
He is. And Varda brings up the idea of, like, as a psychoanalyst, are you gleaning your patients or gleaning from them? And in the sequel, they go into that, and he's like, I had never thought about that till you asked. And she's like, I had never thought about it. And, and it was just like, it was an interesting conversation that the two of them had.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what's fun too, is that you can see her like forming these thoughts in real time, that she's just having a conversation, I mean, with the viewer, but before that, she's having a conversation like with herself, like, what do I think about this subject? Where might this take me? And it's always kind of endearing to watch.
It is. Happen. She's lovely is what she is, Josh.
She is indeed.
And also, and I want to make sure that it's clear. I mean that in the most positive sense, right? I'm not saying that in any type of downplaying way, because like we said, she's a total master of filmmaking.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I think, to compare her to Werner Herzog, I think he's someone who people have this sort of like personal sense of affection for, but at the same time, that doesn't undermine any of his absolute mastery of filmmaking. And I think that's the same thing here, that you can come away from this film thinking, oh, it would be lovely to spend time with Agnes Varda and just listen to her talk. And that's because she has put together this really impressive movie that presents her viewpoint.
Right. And she's just so amiable and delightful. Dave, have you ever written any rap songs about gleaning, perhaps in a early 2000s French hip hop style?
I have not, but I was actually going to say that once you guys start your documentary project, I will definitely write some French rap songs for you.
I love, in all the movies, I love the way she uses music. I think you guys, if you watch Vagabond, the type of kind of weird 80s kind of hip synth pop that she uses it's really, really interesting. She's really good at using music in a movie. I mean, Cleo 5 to 7, the best sequence in the whole movie is when the songwriters come in and they go over all the songs that Cleo might sing, on her next album and everything.
Yeah, I definitely remember that as a highlight from Cleo from 5 to 7. And I did love, because, this is a movie by a 72-year-old filmmaker. You don't necessarily expect that she's going to throw all these hip hop songs in there. And I did love that was it. And all of them, we get the subtitles translate, which I always am sort of like back and forth on whether that's necessary in foreign films, because you don't always need to pay attention to the lyrics of songs in the background. But here they're very relevant. Like, all these songs are about gleaning or scavenging or whatever. And I saw someone on Letterboxd made a reference, and I couldn't discern whether it was a joke about Agnes Varda herself rapping in the movie. And I tried to see if one of these songs was somehow rapped by Agnes Varda, and I don't think so. But it wouldn't surprise me if it was.
I don't think so either. But I do remember Jordy. Do you guys remember Jordy from the 90s? He was like the French baby who rapped.
Oh, I do remember. Je suis
Oh,
bébé. Yes.
baby.
Yes, I do remember him.
Jordy ruled.
That's a deep cut right there.
As deep as we're going to get. I don't think I have anything else that I can add to this conversation once I bring Jordy into it, Josh.
Yeah. Well, if only Agnes Varda had made a movie about Jordy, what's he doing these days?
She could glean what Jordy's raps mean.
She could. Dave, you said you loved this. What was your favorite thing about this film?
I loved how genuinely interested she seemed in not just the topic itself, but all of the people, whether it's the gleaners or the people are gleaning from. Like, she's just really interested in having these conversations and filming all this. And I think it really comes off the screen.
You mentioned that in the sequel, she's like, after I filmed The Lawn, we kept in touch and we met for coffee twice a month over the last 2 years, right? So, and then the other ones were like, when they saw it, and it's been 2 years. How has it been so long? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the reasons why you come away from a movie like this thinking you'd want to spend time with her, because she's so enthusiastic about spending time with anyone, seemingly, and is so eager to learn about their lives and what they do. And it seems genuine. It doesn't seem like some sort of journalistic affectation or whatever. It's really the way that she is.
Yeah, like when Jordy was rapping about how he was a baby, that was real, dude.
Yeah. So should we rate this movie out of 5 heart-shaped potatoes, maybe?
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Heart-shaped potato would be a good name for a band that would never be successful. It gets 3 heart-shaped potatoes, which is almost 6 full potatoes.
That is a lot of potatoes to eat, yeah.
And you know, I think I've said the things I like about her, some of the things that don't, you know, necessarily work for me in some of her movies, but watch everything that you can from her. So yeah, she's great.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I like this a little more than you did. I'm going to give it 3.5 potatoes. And I don't disagree that some of the momentum flags, but I think each individual bit is so enjoyable and the movie is short and I was fully engaged the whole time. So I do definitely want to go back and watch more films than the few that I've seen. So 3.5 from me. Dave, how many heart-shaped potatoes?
Real fast, Josh. I also rate the sequel 3. So if you like this, you should watch the sequel.
Yeah, and that's very short. So I could definitely check that out. So Dave, how would you rate this?
I'm going to 4. Yeah, I just had a great time with it.
All right. Lovely. All of us having a lovely time with Agnes Varda. We'll come back and talk about the legacy of the Gleaners and I. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of the year 2000, we are talking about the documentary The Gleaners and I from Agnes Varda. And I feel like we've talked about a lot of the legacy for Varda herself, which is this sense that she became like the cinephile grandma, you know, that she was so beloved just as a person.
It seems like where Spielberg is right now in Hollywood. Like he's supporting everyone. Everyone loves him. Everyone reveres him. It's kind of in that world right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was even more, though, focused like Herzog on her, like as a person and on her personality, you know, and because as a filmmaker following this movie, she didn't make any more narrative features after this. She just continued with these kinds of documentaries, whether it was that sequel that you mentioned, The Gleaners and I, 2 years later, or The Beaches of Agnes and Varda by Agnes, which was her final film in 2019. All of these, or Faces Places, which became a really big hit. All of these movies are in a similar vein about her kind of exploring things and offering up her thoughts and dealing with, just like this movie does, aging and reflecting on the end of her life and stuff like that. And that was really her whole artistic project for the next 20 years.
Sometimes, like, you know, an artist is born at the right place at the right time, and she really fits not just the French New Wave, but being a French filmmaker, because if you look at her filmography, it's like you said, it's about 1/3 documentary, 1/3 feature narrative, and 1/3 short film. And that's not really something you could do here.
Right. And I think, you know, like I was saying about Jean-Luc Godard, that I think almost more than any of these other French New Wave filmmakers, even ones who kept working, she remained in the conversation. She remained relevant and in multiple different ways, right? This movie is, even if you can draw a line between the two, is very different from Cleo from 5 to 7. And the influence of this movie is different from the influence of that movie. And she was discovered in sort of multiple stages of her career by people who were interested in her films in a way that I think most of those other filmmakers weren't.
When she died, you could look at the quotes from someone like a Scorsese or a Barry Jenkins, Ava DuVernay. Like, she is revered by filmmakers.
Yes, she absolutely is, and deservedly so. I think, again, I'd like to see more. As you said, this was number 67 on the most recent Sight and Sound list of the greatest films of all time, which came out in 2022. It was also on a separate documentary list in, I think, 2014 as one of the greatest documentaries of all time, voted that way by the BBC at one point as well. So definitely like part of the canon. And it was interesting to me. I mean, we talked about this a little, but how much emphasis most of those reviews placed on the idea of this as a digital cinema sort of pioneering work. And I think this really, it was something that kicked off that ability for other filmmakers, including younger filmmakers, to do something personal with a relatively inexpensive consumer camera and make this sort of personal essay type of film.
Yeah, we can't, like I said, we can't really recognize that. You know, I started watching The Man with the Movie Camera, the 1929 Russian film, which is, you know, as kind of influential as any movie that's ever been made. And you watch it now and you're like, oh, it's beautiful. Because I know this is like a influence on Varda, right? And you're like, oh, it's beautiful, it's cool. But like, you can never know the impact that would have had before television, before talkies, before anything like that.
Right. I mean, I think this is something we've talked about, especially in our seasons that look really further back, where we're looking at, you know, the beginning of CinemaScope or color in film or special effects developments, all those kinds of things. It's impossible really for us to understand how revolutionary some of those things were when they first came about.
Dave, have you ever listened to the album The Gleaners, a 2019 bass-only album by jazz raconteur Larry Grenadier?
Can't say I have.
Well, Dave, it was inspired by this film, which of course was inspired by the oil painting The Gleaners by Jean-Francois Millet in 1857.
I saw that mentioned in the movie, actually.
Right. Yeah. The painting comes up multiple times in the movie, but that jazz album does not. And I don't know, you know, I should have looked into, I don't know if there's anything about the current status of gleaning in France right now. As we said, it was something that was like enshrined in law there. But in terms of the US, it definitely made me think of stuff like dumpster diving, you know, freegans and buy nothing groups. And even if it's maybe not as tolerated or encouraged here, it's certainly something that lots of people still engage in.
I mean, again, like, let's get rid of food waste. Let's feed people. There's nothing wrong with that. So.
Right. Absolutely. So the last thing I wanted to mention, as we've done, I think, in a lot of our documentary episodes, is the Documentary Now episode, Trouver Frisson, which is a parody of this film and the whole personal Agnes Varda genre in general. There is a specific bit in Trouver Frisson that references the part in the movie where she comes home and is filming the like stain on her ceiling and is saying like, oh, I've kind of gotten used to it. And in the parody, it turns out that that's like black mold that has addled her brain and made her so quirky.
Hey, Josh, we kind of reference that she was, you know, famously married to Jacques Demy, who is another filmmaker I got to catch up on. What do you recommend from?
I think The Umbrellas of Cherbourg is probably the only Demy movie I've seen, which is the most famous film that he's made. So that's all I got for you.
Do you look at your skin a lot?
I try not to.
Okay.
Because, you know, you're going to notice those things as you get older. And, you know, I'd like not to notice those things. Right. Okay. We're aging. We're not 72 yet, but we'll get there, hopefully.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So my beard is a little, you know, scraggly right now. And I guess it's got a little more gray and white than I'm used to. And yesterday, someone at BattleBots called me Santa Claus. I was like, come on, that's over the top.
Yeah. We don't want to hear this. But one thing that's, again, great about Agnes Varda is she has such an open, welcoming attitude toward all that. She's just curious about it rather than worried.
Yeah, I wish she would have done a documentary on Santa Claus.
All right. I think that'll do it. That's the Gleaners and I. That's this episode of Awesome Movie Year. You can glean from us online and on social media.
Yeah, glean away. You know, we leave it open. We've already harvested. Glean all you want. We're at awesomemovieyear.com, Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram, Awesome Movie Pod on, what do you want to call it today, Josh?
We can just call it Twitter X. If you like it, if you're there, you're there. And if you're not, I understand. You can leave it at that.
I'm Jason Harris Comedy, or Jay Harris Comedy, and all the things. Eat This Comedy is back. I'll be in Netflix is a Joke Festival in May in LA. So if you're down there, come hit me up. Let's see a show that I'm on. I won't see it. I'll be performing in it, but you can come see it. So.
Rousing endorsement there from Jason. You can find some old stuff from me at joshbellhateseverything.com. I'm at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook, at Signal Bleed on that Twitter X place, as well as on Blue Sky and on Letterboxd. And if you are on Letterboxd and watch this movie or any of the movies we talk about, tag them Awesome Movie Year. We'd love to know what you think of any of the movies that we cover here on the show. And you can listen to our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. And if you're in Las Vegas and want to do some gleaning, come down to Wax Trax Records, where whenever my dad does a big buy of records, if there's stuff that he can't really use for the store, he leaves it right out there on the entryway and people could just take them for free.
Wow, that was an actually really relevant use of that.
Yeah. That's a good plug. Way better than me just saying, follow me. I go for Jason on Letterboxd.
Jason, what's in our next episode?
Josh, it's your pick, and it's a crazy pick for you.
Yeah, it's not that crazy, really. It's Wonder Boys, the Curtis Hanson
but
film.
It's not called Wonder Girls, so how did you pick it?
I think we're going to unpack Jason's sexist attitude toward my picks maybe when we get to that.
Your sexist attitude towards not your picks.
I think this is a fallacy here of what sexism is, but we'll maybe not get into that. Instead, we'll talk about Wonder Boys. Tune in for that.
Great movie. I'm excited to watch it.
It is. Tune in for Wonder Boys next time, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.